To begin the lesson this morning, I want to tell you a short little story. And the story just goes like this. There's a man who is just going through terrible times in his life. He's just gone through a whole bunch of setbacks. He's lost his job. His family has fallen apart. His future is uncertain. He's just going through a terrible time. And the only thing he had left is his faith in God. And he was walking through the streets of some major city, and he stopped to watch some workmen who were repairing a cathedral. And you know, cathedrals have these very tall spires. But all these workers were down on the ground working, and he watched a stone mason, somebody who molds and shapes stones. He was watching him chipping away at a piece of stone. And he watched him for some time, and eventually he asked the man what he was doing. And the man's reply was very significant. The man said, "I'm shaping this down here so that it will fit up there. I've got to shape the stone down here so that it's going to fit way up at the top there." And of course, you probably can tell the application there, because tears filled this man's eyes, and he realized that that's what God is doing in his life, shaping him down here so that he will fit up there. And that's really what God does do for us. And so the lesson is called Shaping Us. God shapes us down here so that we will fit up there. What is life's goal? If I had to ask you that, what is the goal of life? Well, many people would say it's being happy, isn't it? The goal of life is to be happy. Not according to the Bible. Not according to God. Life's real goal is not ease, it's not comfort, it's not even happiness. The real goal of life, according to the Scriptures, is a struggle for character and for holiness and for heaven. You're not going to hear that out in the world. The world says, life is YOLO. I don't like that saying, but YOLO. You only live once, and so go out and suck as much out of life as you can, because it's about being as happy as you possibly can be. That is not a scriptural, that's not a Christian philosophy. The Christian philosophy should be, life is about developing character and faith, growing in holiness so that one day you can get to heaven. I want to read you two passages quickly. One is in Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 7. God chose us to be holy. He does not want us to live in sin. Why did God choose us? He chose us to be holy, to be different, to be special, to be unlike the world. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 15. But like the Holy One who called you, you yourselves be holy in all your behavior. Of course, we know God is holy, but He says this is what we've got to be. In fact, He says this is why you were called as Christians, to develop and to grow in your character and in your faith, and to take that path to heaven. The ultimate goal is to get to heaven. The ultimate reason for living is to get to God. Eternity is so much more important than life, than your earthly life. Your earthly life will last a couple of decades, and then it's over. And eternity, of course, goes on forever. But the reason that life has so much meaning is not because of its length. It's because of the impact it has on eternity. How death finds you one day is how eternity will keep you. And so if you're not in the right state with God in the short life that you live, and you don't get shaped down here, you will not be fit for up there. And so your life is extremely important. It does matter, because it's building to something that matters even more. And so life's not about happiness, it's about holiness, about character, and of course about heaven. Another quote, Tim Keller. He said, Jesus Christ did not suffer so that you would not suffer. He suffered so that when you suffer, you'll become more like Him. The gospel does not promise you better life circumstances. It promises you a better life. I think that's a very significant quote, and quite similar to that first one I had up earlier. The key text this morning is from Romans. So if you want to turn there, it's chapter 5. I want to just examine chapter 5, verse 3 to 5. And I'll start by reading it to you. It is also on the screen. It says, "And not only this, but we also exult in our tribulations, knowing that tribulation brings about perseverance, and perseverance, proven character, and proven character, hope. And hope does not disappoint, because the love of God has been poured out within your hearts through the Holy Spirit who was given to us. This is a significant passage. And it goes along the same lines as that story I started with. He is shaping us down here so that we will fit up there. And how does He shape us? He shapes us through trials, through difficulties, through obstacles, through problems. What made me think about this again this morning was that Bible study. Paul is doing God's will. He's an apostle. He's preaching. He's successful in spreading the word. And yet bad things happen to him. I don't have time to read this to you, but he writes a list in Corinthians. He says, I've had this happen and that happen. I've been stoned. I've been in mob situations. I've been in shipwrecks. I've been hungry. I've been cold. I've been lonely. I've had pressures within and without. I've had sickness. Everything that you can imagine has happened to me. He says, I've gone through all of these things, and so I can't think of a better shaped stone than Paul, shaped down here so that he would fit up there. But he tells us to do something that here in this passage that almost seems impossible, isn't it? He says, we also exult in our tribulations. How is it possible to exult in your tribulations? This man in that story was depressed and downhearted and dejected. And that's what happens to us. We moan, we complain, we feel sorry for ourselves, we have self-pity. We say, why me? But Paul says we should exult in our tribulations. Now I just want to make a couple of points here about that sentence before we move on. We can't exult in the trouble itself. I mean, there's a name for that. If you enjoy pain, you're a masochist, isn't it? And the Bible doesn't teach you to be a masochist. He doesn't say you should enjoy pain. You should like the feeling of trouble. You should enjoy being down in the dumps. He doesn't say that at all. The Bible doesn't teach that. Instead, we ought to exult in the midst of these things, despite them, even though your life might have problems, even though things might not be going your way, even though you might have conflict or opposition, or disappointment, or tragedy. We exult nevertheless. We believe in God nevertheless. We serve God nevertheless. We have joy even nevertheless. But we exalt in our tribulations, and the reason we exalt in them is because of the rest of the passage. We exalt in them because of what they are doing to us and for us. What do they do? He says they bring about perseverance or endurance, which brings about character, which brings about hope. I'll get more into that in a second, but let me just say that what you see highlighted in red there, that doesn't come naturally. Or let me say, it doesn't come automatically. You're not going to just automatically exult in your tribulations. You're not going to automatically sing hymns of praise at midnight when you're in pain. That comes with effort, diligence, in other words, hard work, prayer, encouragement of others, fellowship of Christians. It takes everything you've got, basically. You're going to have to deliberately exult in your tribulations. It's not going to happen automatically. And it is possible. It is possible for every Christian to do what Paul did, if they've got the right understanding of what is happening to them in their life. So that same highlighted in red passage there, in the easy to read version, it puts it like this. It says, we are also happy with the troubles we have. And you can tell yourself in your mind whether you are happy with the troubles you have. Do you exult in your tribulations? Could you sing like Paul did, happy songs in the situation that he was in, or not? So let's just go through those steps quickly. There's basically 4 of them. He starts off by talking about suffering. He says we've got to exult in our tribulations, knowing that tribulation brings about perseverance. So the first step in the ladder there is tribulation or suffering. And as I mentioned, we don't rejoice in the fact of our suffering. We rejoice in what we're gaining by our suffering. As a Christian, our suffering has meaning. You know, you're going to suffer, whether you're a Christian or not a Christian. Suffering is a part of being a human being. But if you're not a Christian, your suffering is meaningless. It serves no purpose. It doesn't teach you. It doesn't grow you. You're not going anywhere. It doesn't lead to anything. It is hard life and then death at the end. That's the full stop. I don't know how people who are atheists, who have absolutely no belief in anything, I don't know where they get their hope from. I don't know where they get their meaning from. Because life is tough. And if your philosophy is life is hard and bad things happen and then you die, and that's it, I don't know how you maintain your state of mind in that kind of situation. But a Christian has the understanding life is tough. There are problems. I'm going to go through things. It will be painful, but it has purpose. I've compared it to you before to a woman in labor. And nowadays you're not supposed to talk about things you haven't experienced. So, anyway, here I am. It's bad. You've got to just watch it to know it's bad. You don't have to experience it to know it's bad. It's bad. Why do women keep having babies? Why do some women have 5 babies? They almost die with the first one, and then you see them 2 years later and they've got a big stomach again. Oh, I'm having another one. But you said never again. Yeah, and then they have another one. And they have another one. Why? Their pain has a purpose. When all of it is over and it's horrible and it's difficult, when it's over, there's a baby. And it's so thrilling to have the baby that, well, the pain just gets kind of forgotten, isn't it, eventually? Otherwise nobody would have children, or more children. But we do. People continue to have children and they continue to go through that pain because the pain has a purpose. If pain has a purpose, you can endure it. Just meaningless, pointless pain is what people can't handle. And what Paul is saying here is that your pain leads to something. Your suffering as a Christian leads to something. God's got a plan. There's His hand in it. But He's achieving something by putting you through these things. Shaping us down here so that we'll fit up there. What we gain in the end far outweighs what we're going through down here. There's a song we sing that says, just one glimpse of Him in glory will the toils of life repay. All the troubles you've ever had, all the difficulties you've ever had, one moment of looking at God in heaven, as you walk into heaven one day, will repay all of that. And then there's still an eternity to go. So that's step one. Then he says the suffering, if you go through these lessons and you learn as a Christian, what does it produce? He says it produces perseverance. Some of your Bibles will say endurance. Some of your Bibles will say patience, but it kind of all has the same meaning. It means to bear up under something without giving up or throwing in the towel or walking away from it. There's a story about a young man who asked a preacher to pray that he would have more patience. He went up to the preacher and said, I don't know why people do that. Why they think a preacher's prayers are any different to anybody else's. But he went to the preacher and he said, could you just pray that I have more patience? So the preacher immediately bowed his head and said, Lord, please send this young man more trouble and trials. He's got it too easy. Give him some hard times. What are you doing? He said, you asked me for patience. And the Bible says tribulations lead to patience. That's what he says. This is literally exactly what the passage says. In other words, the Christian life is a long distance race. It's a test of endurance. You've got to slog it out as a Christian. There's going to be ups, there's going to be downs, there will be obstacles, there's many temptations, there's a lot of opposition, people are going to push back against your beliefs. The world out there is not particularly in agreement with a lot of things you believe. And so it's an endurance race. And so he says you go through these troubles, these trials, the suffering, and it teaches you to endure. It gives you strength. It gives you endurance. And then what does that lead to? If you get resilience and endurance and you become strong, what does that lead to? Well, he says that leads to character. Proven character, he says. To put it another way, suffering lies along the path to spiritual maturity. I know you all know this passage, but I'll read it to you again anyway. James chapter 1 says a very similar thing to what we're reading here. He says, "Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials." That's the same as saying exult in your tribulations. "Knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." In other words, mature. You want to be mature as a Christian? You want to have a strong faith? You want to be able to say, "It is well with my soul"? Then let the trouble come. Let the obstacles come. Let the difficulties come. And go through them. Go through them with faith. Go through them with hope. Go through them with joy. And when you get to the other side, what are you going to be? Proven. Tested. As long as you have a good life and an easy life and a simple life, you're not tested. You don't know whether you're strong. You don't know whether your faith is real. You don't know whether you actually really mean what you claim to believe. But then when it's tested, you'll know. Either it'll fall apart or it won't. And you build something, and then when the elements really have a go at it and a very big storm comes, you'll see, does it stay up or does it fall down? Ray Steadman, a preacher, wrote these words. He said, "God is in the process of making veterans. He delights to take raw, untested rookies and put them in the crucible. When they come out, they aren't raw, untested, and they aren't rookies anymore. They're veterans, men and women of proven character." So why do we exult in our tribulations? Because they make us strong and they give us a proven character. We get a track record. We get to see God at work. We get to see how faithful God is. We get to see how powerful faith is. We get to see how strong hope is that anchors our soul in place. We get to see how deep joy is, that it can bubble over even when it doesn't seem possible to do that. Now, you can't get any of those things in the good times. You get those things in the bad times. There's a great little saying somebody came up with. They said, "God's blessings are poured out in bitter cups." That's really well put. God's blessings come in bitter cups. The best things God has got for you, unfortunately, sorry to be the one to tell you this, is going to come often wrapped up in the hardest situations in your life, the toughest times. Another saying, somebody said, "A smooth sea has never made a skillful sailor." I told you can build a boat and you can leave it in the harbour. And you can sit on a deck chair on the back of the boat. You can call yourself a sailor. But you aren't really a sailor, isn't it? How do you become a good sailor? You've got to get out the harbour, first of all. And then you've got to do some sailing. And you've got to go through some weather. And you've got to go through different currents and different kind of situations. And then you can claim to be a good sailor. But as long as you're in the harbour, you aren't any good, because you don't know if you're any good, because you haven't got any way to tell. There's no resistance. And so you have no ability to know. So the troubles lead to the strength, and the strength leads to the character. And once we have a proven character, once we've seen God at work, once we've watched our faith survive something, once we've experienced joy and hope despite our circumstances, that leads to an unshakable, an unbreakable kind of hope within us that can't be taken away. So once suffering has done its work, the final result is hope. Nothing is really wasted in a believer's life. Go back and read some of the lives of the people in the Bible. Go look at someone like we studied Joseph's life a while back in detail. A great faithful man who loved God, but what troubles he had. As a young boy, his brothers hated him so much that they threw him down a hole because they wanted to kill him. They actually were going to leave him down there to die. And one brother felt a little bit sorry, so not very sorry, because they still sold him into slavery. Their own brother, a boy, tied him up, gave him to some slave traders, and they thought never to see him again. Went into a distant land, to a place he didn't know anything about, a language he didn't understand, just lost and alone in the world. But look at how his life turned out. Look at what happened to him. When he was there, his faithfulness was undiminished. His love of God was undiminished. His character was strong. Potiphar's wife tested that, and jail tested that, and success and fame tested that, but he passed all the tests. He became very powerful and very rich and very successful, and eventually he saved his whole family. Those same brothers who tried to kill him, he saved them. You all know it's a very dramatic story. They come down to Egypt because basically there's a famine and they're dying of hunger, and they say to this great mighty Egyptian leader, they fall down and they say, please can you just give us some food? We're just these poor wanderers down there in Palestine. They don't recognize him. To cut a long story short, he reveals himself to them and they're terrified. They think he's going to kill them. And then he says that wonderful thing. You all know what it is, I suppose. He said to them, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. You thought you were doing a bad thing. You thought you were getting rid of me. God had a good thing in mind. And so he forgave them. And he saved them and he welcomed them into the land of Egypt and gave them the best land. You meant it for evil, God meant it for good. There's a passage in Romans that says, all things work together for good to those who love him. And so I go back to where I started. That man watching the stonemason getting that stone ready. And that mason said a very significant thing. The mason said, I'm molding it down here, I'm shaping it down here so that it will fit up there. And in the same way, that's what God does for us. He is shaping us down here so that we will fit up there in heaven. But in order to be shaped, you've got to go through the things you're supposed to go through. You have to let your faith be tested. You have to allow your hope to be strained. You have to let your joy be pressured to see whether they're going to hold up. And as you survive these things and as you overcome these things, you get stronger. And you develop a proven character. And that gives you more hope to continue. And it just generates more and more. And so you can walk along the road like Paul did. Nothing could really, as far as I can tell, nothing could get Paul down. What are you going to do to make Paul give up? Or get depressed or despair? Sometimes he was alone. And I'm not suggesting that he didn't battle with these things. I'm not suggesting you walk around with a smile, sort of a fake smile on your face, telling people everything is great when it's not great. In fact, the Bible says, what should you do with those who weep? He says, weep with those who weep. There's a time to cry. There's a time to battle through things. As I mention always about Job, Job struggled and battled and screamed and shouted and fell to the floor and cried. And in fact, he even said in the beginning he said, I wish I was never born. Is it okay for a Christian to struggle? Yes. Cry? Yes. Battle? Yes. But it's possible to survive also. It's possible to have faith and hope and love and joy and peace and all the other things that he's promised, despite whatever happens to you. And you can endure those things if you realize there's a purpose, there's a reason. You are being shaped down here so that you can fit up there. Let's think of that as we all stand and sing 27.